Hello and welcome to the Daily Newspaper Analysis, an initiative of the UPSConline.com and Ambition IS. Today we shall be discussing the newspaper of the 27th of December 2017. So coming to the first article, Countering Growing Inequality. This is an article on the editorial page of The Hindu and is the most important article for today. The opinion that the author has given is that the Indian social policy must raise health and education levels all around as China has done. Now, the context of this article is that of the recent World Inequality Report 2018, which has been released, and it has given some stark figures in the context of India's inequality. Now, the figures are that the top 1% of Indian population is holding 22% of India's income. Also, the top 0.1% have more growth than the bottom 50% of Indian population. Also, the top 10% of the Indian population has 56% of the income. Now, some basic understanding. Suppose this is the population and this is the income. Now, in a country where there is absolute equality in income as well amongst the people, what will happen is that suppose 1% of the population, then the income that the 1% of population is going to be that again 1% of the national income. Suppose 100% of population, the income will be equally distributed as the 100%. However, if there is any deviation from this curve, it represents that there is inequality. And the deviation in case of India is huge because 1% of the population is having an income of approximately 22%. So this is what is the entire issue. Now, first and foremost in the report, the author has brought about a point that the relevance of this report is questionable because it has been based on the analysis of top incomes. However, total analysis of the entire country, total income analysis has not been done in this report. But the author says that this can be refuted on the grounds that social indicators also reveal that there is a rising trend of inequality in India. Another point that is important under the context is that this trend of inequality has been on a rise after the economic reforms in India, which officially started in the year 1991 and unofficially they began since the mid 1980s itself. So that is another question. That means post independence, after 1950 till mid 1980s, the policy that Indian government was explicitly following was largely a socialist one. It was after that a new form of socialism, which India called its economic reforms, was introduced, and it is in this aftermath that inequality has risen. Also, the author has basically his entire editorial is aimed at a comparison with China. The author says that this being a world inequality report, it provides global data, and a comparison with China is pertinent here. Why? Because the economy of China grew by 800% since 1980, whereas India's economy has only grown by 200%. Also, there is comparatively less inequality in China, as the top 1% of China is home to 14% of the national income of China as compared to the 22% national income in case of India. Also, there is a higher average income in China. The per capita income in China is 5 times higher than the per capita income in India. So these are certain issues which represent the fact that how China has been a successful, comparatively more successful economy compared to India. In that context, the comparison with China is warranted. Now coming to the Indian case here, despite the decline in inequality for 3.5 decades after 1950, inequality grew after economic reforms. And India has been a constant supporter of a socialist policy. This was Nehruvian idea of socialism, and India's freedom struggle was aimed on the policy of socialism. And in the aftermath of independence also, India stood its ground to socialist policies until the economic reforms of 1991, where beyond the reforms, India opened its markets and became somewhat a capitalistic country. Even at that point of time, India refused to openly and explicitly claim the status of a capitalist country and said that India would form its own kind of socialism where the government would actively participate in upbringing and upliftment of the poor. So that was India's ideology. The ideology was that growth should not be unequalizing. So that is the Indian case. Coming further to the validity of comparison with China. Now, this is a question that is important because of the issue of democracy. Now, India is a democratic state and it has had successful democracy since independence. Whereas this has not been the case with China, which is largely a closed political system, with the Communist Party of China being at the helm of Chinese affairs. And democracy there is only a namesake democracy, and complete freedom of the citizens in China is not there. So many people argue that comparing India and China is not valid because both have different political situations. However, the author here states that comparison between India and China is much warranted because despite the difference in the political systems, both countries had been large agrarian economies and similar per capita income levels at the time of their start during the 1980s. So this is a very good analysis that the author has drawn. Also, the author further says that it is not merely an absence of democracy that ensures the success of any particular economy. For example, North Korea does not have democracy, but it has definitely not reached the levels that China has reached. And he says that for a populous, poor country to lift itself to a higher growth path and stay there requires imaginative public policy and steady governance, which China has shown. And definitely there is a case for studying the Chinese policy. So in this context, we move forward to the lessons that can be learned from China's case. The lessons are that the Chinese leadership focused on driving for growth as well as investing in the human capital. This is the crux of this article, that the Chinese experiment is largely around human capital. Now, the author gives a good definition of something called the human capital, which he says that human capital is a person's endowment derived from education and health. So he describes human capital as a result of two variables, that is education and health. And the author says that both these variables will result to building the stronger human capital for the country, which was in case of China. Also, the author has given a good analysis here, that he says that the human capital figures of China are largely in the shape of a rectangle, where a large number of people come under are a good source of human capital. A large number of people are coming in the top ambit of the rectangle. Whereas in India's case, the human capital is largely a pyramid, where a very minuscule population is coming in the ambit of its most developed human capital. So this is a good analysis. These diagrams are important in your answers. If there is an opportunity, you should give such kind of a figurative explanation in your answers. This will fetch you more marks. Also, China has developed into a manufacturing hub, which India couldn't. And not only that, it did develop into a manufacturing hub because its human capital was developed. The manufacturing abilities of China could percolate, and therefore benefit was reaped for all the people in general, and therefore not only the growth rates were high, levels of inequality were low. So this is the classic case of China. Further, he says that share of Indian population with secondary schooling is 15%, rather less than 15%. And this was China's status in the 1970s. So a comparison between China and India can be drawn, that even today India is not up to the standards of what China was in the 1970s. Also, the issue of human capital here is the recent education report, which states that the quality of education in India is abysmal. So that is another issue. Not only is there a problem of enrollment, there is another added problem of quality of education. The health sector in India is highly weak. So the question is that the human capital in India is not being able to develop itself, and especially at a point when India is at the verge of its demographic dividend. In such a scenario, inequality is bound to exist in any economy. Despite the fact that the economy will grow, inequality will be persistent. So that is one thing that the author has brought to the fore in this article. Also, in China's case, there was a massive participation of women in the workforce, which continues to be an issue in India even today, especially in the formal economy, like in the services sector, and for that matter in the minimal manufacturing sector. Women do participate in the agricultural sector, but there also their participation is disguised. So that those are some issues which are related to India. Further, the author says that despite that, there is some rebuttal to it, that complete human development does not happen until and unless the human beings are given freedom. So this is one thing that is against China, but this is not the entire picture, and you should not consider it as paint the whole picture with the same brush, because China, despite the fact that agreed it doesn't provide freedom to its citizenry, but on the fronts of education and health, China has made massive strides, which should be acknowledged. Further, on the issue of democracy in India, many people argue that India's case is different from China because India had democracy and certain hard decisions which China probably took, India couldn't take. In such a scenario, the author refutes this safeguard for India and says that democracy can never be a hampering content for inequality, because he says even in India's context, if you compare, different states have shown different levels of growth and different levels of improvement on the issue of inequality. And so he says that in the same political milieu and the similar political conditions, some states have performed better than the other states, which clearly reflects and proves the fact that democracy, as the all encompassing villain of economic progress, is something that is not justified. So this is a very good point. Another thing is that the author has given some suggestions that what should be done. The suggestions are that in the present backdrop, focus of the public policy should be towards human development, as lessons have been drawn from China's case. Also, the social policy that raises health and education levels at the bottom of the pyramid should be the focus of the government. So this is the entire crux of this article. The article becomes important from a number of perspectives, especially in General Studies Paper 1, the social issues, education, health, women's participation. All of this is very, very important. Another thing is that the 1991 reforms have marked the 25th anniversary in 2016, and a review on these policies is something that is mandatory. Also, this can be justified in the case of the globalization and anti-globalization debate, that globalization has been adversarial for India. If you have to give such arguments, you can give that the report has shown inequality. So that is where the article has its utility. Coming to the next article, how India rejects bad patents. Now, the opinion is that strong standards of patents have filtered the bad from the good with the least administrative and financial burden. Now, the context is that India has strong patent laws, and not only that, India is a leader of the developing world with regards to patents. Now, coming to the background, the article is largely an analysis of India's Patent Act of 1970, which was amended in 2005. Now, the issue is that, as we all know, that WTO is the governing body for the intellectual property rights, and it was in the aftermath of WTO, which was formed officially in 1993, that formal suggestions were laid down on intellectual property rights. And the year 2005, India incorporated the ideas of the WTO and made some amendments. Now, there is a controversy over patents of critical pharmaceutical drugs in India, and time and again issues are being raised. The most recent being of 2013, the historic judgment by Supreme Court over the drug Gleevec, which is an anti-cancer drug by the company Novartis. That is a historic judgment of the Supreme Court. Now, in the WTO provision, there is something called Article 8, which provides for an opportunity to the member countries, as a right to protect the public health. In this article, there's an exception that they can, in order to protect the public health, they can make some exceptions to the intellectual property rights. And this is the article that India has used. So that is about the background of this issue. Coming to the most contentious part of this act is the section 3D. This section is the most stringent under the act, and it prevents something called evergreening of patents. Now, what is this idea of evergreening of patents? Now, you have to understand that whenever a development or an innovation takes place, that requires certain research and development, and this research and development requires funds. So, if the person who is conducting this research and development is not paid back for his research, for the funds that he has invested, in such a scenario, the process of innovations will not be remunerative. And it is in this light that the protections to intellectual property have been laid down. However, there is a certain time period for these protections. For example, a scientist comes out with a drug for maybe AIDS or cancer, some big drug. and that one scientist or a particular laboratory for that matter has spent suppose $300 million in research. Now the analysis will be drawn, various countries will see that how this should be compensated. So suppose 20 years are decided that for 20 years they will have a patent, and only they can manufacture this drug and sell it at a particular cost, so that their funds are regenerated. After this period of 20 years, the drug will be open for manufacturing as a generic drug, and its cost will be highly reduced. So after 20 years, the drug will be available to the people at much cheaper prices. What happens is that after 20 years, the company will come with another form of this drug, which will have a minor change in its structure and that or its efficacy, and then they will reapply for a patent for another 20 years. So the issue here is that the developed countries like the US and UK, which are largely capitalist countries, and they have a huge lobby of capitalists, in these countries, the regimes and the rules of intellectual property rights are loose. So in getting patents in these countries is something very easy. However, for countries like India, which are developing countries, there is a constraint of budget, and also there is a rising need of health issues in the country. The citizens are poor, they cannot afford such high cost drugs. So in such light, the rules that countries like India have adopted are stringent. So that is the entire debate between the developed and the developing countries, and this is a debate which is one of the major issues of WTO, and US and India are at opposite ends here. Also, the case of US, where US had put India was planning to put India, it was planning to put India under the priority watch list of countries which have poor patent laws as per the US capitalist lobbies. Further, the stand that India has had is that it shall not allow evergreening of patents. Also, that it will not welcome trivial innovations. The principle that India uses is that of non-obviousness. This is a key word. Here the idea is that the innovation that any researcher has done should be non-obvious. So that will be the key for granting a patent, and it should be a major innovation. Also, on the matter of litigation, there is something called the Intellectual Property Office in India, and it is at this office level only that majority of the patent applications are accepted or rejected under Section 3D of the Indian Patents Act 1970. But some cases reach to the litigation level. Now, to prevent litigation on these matters, there is a principle called as the as the pay for delay principle, whereby the companies like in the case of Novartis and the Gleevec drug, if the case is going on for 5 years, then the company Novartis has to pay generic companies a certain amount of fee to prevent them from manufacturing Gleevec drug in the period after the patent has expired. So that is a deterrent in itself, where companies are deterred to go into litigation. That is another issue with India. For the developing world, it is a good thing, but countries like the US and UK, they object to this flaw and in the litigation process of India. Another thing is that despite the fact that the litigation work can be conducted and major companies can fight, the major loss is that of vulnerable patients who will suffer and will have to pay higher prices for drugs which are already, no more patents in the country. So that is one issue that the author has brought about. Also, there is an issue, as I mentioned before, of constrained government budgets in case of developing countries. Also, in this case, India has assumed a leadership status, and many developing countries, especially in Africa and many third world countries, are looking up to India and have taken stand as per India. And you must understand one thing, that all of intellectual property rights and Intellectual Property Act in India is as per the WTO norms, and none of the WTO norms are violated by India. So India has become a global leader in this case. So that is another thing that is important. Coming to the next article, this is an interview by a Swedish journalist, Bertil Linter. Now, the interview was important for India-China relations, and there are some good points that the author has brought about in the interview. some good issues have been raised. First and foremost, the author in the first question talks about the 1962 war between India and China, and this is important in the post-independence history, where the causes of the war, many causes are there for the war, but one cause that the author has brought about is that the war was not something that was a sudden knee-jerk reaction of 1962, but rather it was something that was brewing since 1959. The author talks about the domestic conditions in China during 1959, where he says that China at that point of time was facing a crisis, and its Communist Party under Mao Zedong, the leader of China at that point of time, was in crisis. The leader's credibility was at its least, and he was the least popular at that point within China. So, in such a scenario, China had targeted India because India under Nehru had become a leader of the third world countries, and Nehru was a statesman. And in such a scenario, just to distract the political climate within China, a war was declared on India. And as a result of that war, we all know that in 1962 war, India lost to China. And so this was a major setback for our leader, our first Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru. And he had died in 1964, soon after the war. Whereas in China, the credibility of their leader was strengthened in the aftermath of the war. So that is the analysis that the author here has brought about. That, and this is a good analysis as amongst the plethora of reasons that are given for the 1962 war. So this is one such reason. The second issue that has been brought about is the inevitability or the non-possibility of war between India and China. Here the author says that despite several claims and crescendos by extremist groups that there is a possibility of war between India and China in the present scenario, the author refutes this claim and says that this is not possible because trade for both India and China is very, very important, and there are several issues where the two countries are engaging, so they will not go in for a war. Another issue that the author has given is that there is something called a new Cold War. This is a good keyword which you can use in your answer, that there is a new Cold War in Asia where India and Japan are forming one bloc, and China and its partners are forming another bloc. So it's sort of a Cold War situation. Also, on the recent Doklam standoff, the author has given a good idea that the Doklam standoff was not something that China was intending to do with India. Rather, it was a Chinese attempt to drive a wedge between India and Bhutan. So whenever you are analyzing or discussing the Doklam issue, the Doklam standoff, you should bring the Bhutan issue, that how the Doklam standoff has shown China's interest of building inroads into Bhutan. Bhutan is the only country in India's neighborhood which is not directly under the influence of China as of now. And through this Doklam standoff, China has tried to build inroads into Bhutan itself. So that is the whole issue. Another good point that the author has brought about is that of a strategic advantage through border issue. The author says that China is not interested in solving the border issue with India. Now, these are personal opinions. You can use them in with a lot of flexibility. There is no credibility to these opinions because it's an individual's own opinion. So if opportunity is provided, you can use these ideas with caution. So that is one disclaimer that I would want to give you. Now, the strategic advantage is that China is not interested in solving the border issue with India. Rather, maintaining the border problem with India gives China a strategic advantage of that bullying India, or for that matter controlling and dominating India. So that is one aspect that the author has highlighted here. Also, he calls something like Great Game East in the countries of Maldives and Myanmar. He says that China is focusing on these eastern countries with recently signing the free trade agreement with Maldives. Also, China's participation in Myanmar, China's building of infrastructure in Myanmar is something that should be a major concern to India. Another point that the author has brought about here is that India does not focus on its eastern border as much as it focuses on its western border. Whereas the author says that it is of utmost importance that India should focus on its eastern border with Myanmar. Why? Because it is this eastern border which is China's route into the Indian Ocean. And also it is the eastern border that is more critically and more strategically located to China's economic centers and economic zones like the Rakhine province. So this is something that is important to China rather than the western borders. For example, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which India has criticized to and opposed to, is not of much importance to China. Why? Because the corridor connects Gwadar Port to Xinjiang province in China, and the Xinjiang province in China is not very strategic, nor is it a major economic hub for China compared to the eastern regions in China, which are connected through Myanmar. So that is what the author is trying to bring about. Also, on the context of the eastern border and the eastern route, he has said that there are certain issues related to India. First is that there is comparatively much poor infrastructure in India as compared to China. Also, there is red tapeism in India. So the trade agreements between Myanmar and India are not something that are happening with the pace they're happening with the pace that they're happening with China. So red tapeism is something that India should do away with in this context. Also, there is an issue of some rebel groups. So that is the entire picture that the author has painted. Now, a good suggestion or an opinion has been given with regards to the eastern border, where the author says that in the eastern border, countries like Myanmar would be any day more willing to participate and trade with India, because China's might is not something that is a worry for India only, it is a worry for all other countries. So in that context, India has a good opportunity to link with these countries more than China. This is an opinion you can use whenever you are supposed to discuss that how India can counter China's influence in its traditional zones of influence. So this is one good example there. Coming to the next article, after the sanctions. Now, the context of this article is the UN sanctions on North Korea, which have recently been imposed by the UN. So that is the context. Now, we all know that North Korea has come out with its nuclear capabilities. In the context of the recent intercontinental ballistic missile, which North Korea claims can hit any part of North America. Also, claims by North Korea that it has a hydrogen bomb. So these issues regarding nuclear capabilities of North Korea is the background of these sanctions. Also, there is a rising international frustration over the nuclear standoff in the Korean peninsula itself. Furthermore, the recent ransomware virus, the WannaCry virus, which was a global cyber attack, is something that the US claims was generated in North Korea. So again, there is international crescendo against North Korea. So that is the context and the background of this article. Now, the sanctions are that 89% of a curb should be there on the refined petroleum imports to North Korea. This will, critically impact North Korea. Also, expulsion of thousands of North Koreans in other countries within a time period of 2 years. Not only is this a stand against the North Korean citizens, it will also cut off foreign remittances that North Korea is receiving through its diaspora. So that is another issue. So these are the sanctions that have been imposed. Now, the issues that are important in this article are that what is unique to these sanctions, the unique point is that first time Beijing and Russia have supported these sanctions. Otherwise, Beijing and Russia have had a view that instead of sanctions, the efforts should be focused on engagement with North Korea and diplomacy with North Korea. But despite their views, they have supported the UN sanctions because these sanctions have come from the United Nations Security Council, which could not have been come until the Permanent Five would have agreed to it. So that is an important part. Another thing is that it is a reminder for the US that the scope of military options may be increasingly narrowing in the Korean peninsula. America has been threatening North Korea for war and dire consequences, but the UN sanctions somehow uphold the credibility of UN, which is waning in the recent times. So that is another issue that becomes important here. Now, the suggestion that the author has given is that of reviving the six-party talks, though this is not in the article. The article only talks about something called P5+1 talks, which were the talks that were held with Iran. The P5 were the permanent 5 members of the UN, and +1 was Germany. So these talks were a success in brokering a deal with Iran. However, the agreement itself is under threat now under the Trump administration. So that is one concern, but the author has advocated on something like a P5+1 talks. But in the past, there was something called six-party talks between North Korea. And in 2009, these talks were withdrawn. North Korea had withdrawn from the six-party talks. The six-party talks had countries which included China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, Russia, and the US. So these talks should be resumed back. That is the suggestion that the author has given. And in general, an opinion on North Korea is being built, and that opinion is common across many editorials, and that is diplomacy remains the best option to bring North Korea to disarmament talks rather than such aggressive and extreme stands, like one amongst them being sanctions on North Korea. So that is a stand which probably I would suggest you should reflect in your answers. With this, I finish today's discussion. I hope you liked the video and you will recommend it to your friends. We shall be welcoming your feedback. Hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.